One of the coolest new Next.js hooks is called useOptimistic, and it allows us to do the following. So if I type here test, if I click add now, you can see it immediately gets added to the list here. I don't have to wait 2 or 3 seconds before it's updated in the database and then the latest data is fetched again. It immediately adds this to the list, and it's optimistic. The UI is optimistic because most of the time when we add something to the database, it's going to succeed. So we might as well just immediately add it. It's going to be a very snappy UI for the user. This is the future of UIs. Let's take a look at how this hook works. And also what we want, of course, is that if something does indeed go wrong, so if the database doesn't get properly updated, that it's automatically removed again as well. We can do both of that today in Next.js. Let's take a look at how to do that. All right, so I have this simple example here. We just have a to-dos page, and this is a server component. So what we can do is we can actually fetch data here. I'm using Prisma, but doesn't matter, works with any database. I can fetch data, and those are my to-dos. So we want to have interactivity with useOptimistic. So we're going to put the rest of the page in a separate component. I call that the to-dos component. So this component takes those to-dos. I'm using TypeScript here, and this is where we have the rest of the page, right? So we have this form and we have that list. So here we actually map over those to-dos that we fetch in this server component. And then we have our form, and this form is using a server action, right? So I have a lot of videos about server actions. Make sure you check them out, right? So the server action add to do is this one. Right, so here, when we submit this form, the data is going to be submitted here. We grab the content here, and here we add it to the database, and then we revalidate it, meaning it will grab the latest data from the database. But basically, it's going to execute this line again, and so it's going to pass the new to-dos here. This component gets new to-dos, so the props are different, and it's going to re-render. So it's going to map over the new to-dos. Right, so if I do this now, if I now say test 2, if I press add here, it's going to take some time, right? So here I'm waiting like 2 or 3 or even longer, right? So it took me like 5 seconds before this test 2 was added to the list here. But it can be snappier. We have the technology these days to immediately show test 2. So now we're going to use that useOptimistic hook. Let's see how we can do that. So here, let's see, I have some type definitions. Don't use interface. I have a separate video on that. Just use type. That's just for the prompts here. So now we're going to import that hook, and it's still experimental as of recording this video. Optimistic, so you're going to see experimental useOptimistic. Now we can alias that as simply useOptimistic, and then we can use that hook here. So we can just call that hook. It's going to give us two things. It's going to give us the optimistic version of the to-dos, right? So the to-dos that we get as props here, those are always coming from the database, right? Because that's what we're fetching here. We're fetching these to-dos from the database. So that's always what we're getting here, the actual to-dos. And now we're going to have the optimistic version of that, and then also a way to add something to that, add optimistic to-do. Okay, so these are the two things that we're going to get, and we need to pass in 2 arguments here as well. So we need to pass the to-dos here. Those are going to be the initial to-dos that we get here, and then we can add a to-do as soon as we submit this form. So I'm going to copy paste it because it looks complicated and it takes some time to write out. So here the second argument is a function, and this function takes in the current state. So this is like a reducer pattern, and then we can add something here with this add optimistic to-do function. That's going to be the new to-do type to-do, and what we return here is simply the new optimistic to-dos, right? So this looks complicated, but let's see how we can use it. So now I can copy optimistic to-dos. So here we're mapping over to-dos, but that's always coming from the database. So this is like the slow way of doing it. So now we want to have optimistic to-dos. It's going to map over that. The logic is still the same, right? The structure of the to-dos, it's all the same. It's just the optimistic version now. We're still using the traditional to-dos here when we invoke that use optimistic. So the hook still needs access to that. So now we're mapping over optimistic to-dos, right? So I saved here, and you can see it still works the same way. So now if I add test 3, if I click add here, it won't work. So I still have to wait a couple of seconds. Let's see. Yeah, so it still takes a couple of seconds before it gets added here. We need to do one more thing. We need to add something to the optimistic to-dos before we actually invoke the server action. As soon as we invoke the server action, we have to await that like 3 seconds. So what we can do is we have server actions, but you also have client actions. So here we can specify a function. You get the form data here from Next.js. And actually I get a suggestion here from Copilot, which is actually what we want. And this does need to be async, and we're going to await the server action here. So let's see what's happening here. So this function right now is a client action. So this will run on the client here, and it will always give you that form data. If you use the action attribute, it's going to give you the form data here. Now we want to grab the content, that's the input name, right? What we pass here. And then we want to add something to the optimistic to-dos here immediately before we invoke the server action. So we do need to add an ID here because I'm using the ID here for key. And typically this is created in the database, but here it's not added to the database yet. So I'm just going to create a random ID. And then we need to actually pass the content. Now the content here can be of type, because we're grabbing it from the form, it can be of different types. So I'm just going to assert that it's going to be a string. And then we need to actually invoke the server action. And the server action is actually just expecting the form data. So we'll just pass the form data there. Remember, this can take 3 seconds. So before we do that, we want to add something here. So now I'm going to save here. And now I'm going to say test number 10. And now let's see what happens if I click add. I'm going to click now. And you can see it immediately gets added to the list here. Right? So that's really cool, very snappy. Right? So now let's also check the database. I'm going to open up Prisma Studio. And you can see if I look at my database, test 10 is also added to the database. So now it was immediately added on the UI, but also in the database. So all of that is still working. So if I now refresh the page and it fetches the actual to-dos from the database, we will actually see test 10 here. Right? So this is a very snappy, almost futuristic UI. This is really going to be the future of UI, I think. Now what happens here in the server action? Right? So here in the server action, when we actually add the to-do, we're optimistic, but sometimes, things can go wrong. So how do we make sure that if it goes wrong, it also gets removed from the UI here? Right? So by the time we get here, it has already been added here, the to-do. Right? So now when we go to the server action here, what if something goes wrong here? What if I make a typo here? Right? So here we're grabbing the content from form data, but what if I make a typo here or something else goes wrong? Millions of things can go wrong here. So typically you do want to wrap this in a try catch, because there will be an error thrown here if something goes wrong here, and we want to catch that error, otherwise our application is gonna crash. So we need to attempt to do this, and if something goes wrong, we want to catch the error. Right, now I have separate videos on how to do proper error handling with these server actions, so make sure you check out my other videos. You can just grab the error, you can output a toast message. Here we'll just do something simple. We'll just return an object to the client and we'll just say something went wrong. All right, so if I save here, and now we are making this mistake, right? So something could go wrong, we're catching the error. And so now if I do this, I do test number 15, let's say. If I click add here, it immediately gets added here. So the add optimistic call is still working, but we make a mistake here. If I go to the database now, it's not going to be inserted in the database. So here, if I look for test 15, it's not here. And so here something goes wrong, but on the UI, it actually shows it here, right? And if I reload, test 15 will not be here, right? Because then it's getting the actual data from the database and where it's not present. Clearly, we need to fix this. So here we add optimistic to do. We want to sort of undo this or revert this if something goes wrong in this, and we go in the catch block here. The trick here is to use the revalidatePath function. So whenever you call this function, you will just get the latest data from the database again. So what we can do is, if it goes wrong, we can just call this. So before we return, I'm going to paste it. I'm going to add it here. So now what's going to happen is, when I submit the form here, we're going to add the optimistic to do. Right, so it's going to be shown on the UI here. Then we're going to run the server action. The server action will try to insert that in the database, but that doesn't work because there's some problem here. So we're going to catch the error, and then we're going to call revalidatePath, which will sort of manually invoke this server component to run again. So the server component will run again. We'll grab the latest data from the database where test 15 is not present, right? Because something goes wrong here. So test 15 will not be in that database, returned from the database here. So we just get the latest data. So let's see how this works. I'm going to click add here, immediately add it to the UI here, and let's see what happens. After a couple seconds, it gets removed, right? So it's going to be optimistic to the UI. And then if something actually goes wrong, we basically say, well, rerun this component again and grab the latest data from the actual database, right? Where we actually have our source of truth. And test 15 is not present there because it didn't actually add that to the database here, right? So here it's just going to get the actual data, the actual to-dos. All right, now what if we don't make a mistake and it will actually get properly added to the database? Do we then also want to call revalidatePath? Because it has already been added to the UI. So do we need to actually fetch the data from the database again? And that's a good question. You could make the argument for doing that as well. So in both cases, you actually just want to revalidate. So you can actually also use the finally block here. So in both cases, it will just fetch the latest data, right? So if I save here one last try, I'm going to say test 20. I'm going to press add here. Immediately it gets added to the UI here. And now we don't make a mistake here. So it should get properly added to the database. You can see it stays here. So now if I refresh, it should be in the database and everything should work as expected. So you can see indeed test 20 is also added to the database now, right? So really cool hook. We also use it in my React Next.js course, so highly recommend you check that out if you want to be a professional React or Next.js developer. In any case, make sure you've mastered the underlying fundamentals, both JavaScript as well as CSS. I have courses on them both. Check out the links in the description. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.